So far, we've talked about inequality across an entire society or country, but often we want to think about equality taking account of differences in individuals' locations, background, or other characteristics. This means we may want to distinguish between inequality within a certain group and inequality across groups. For example, we might want to know how much education affects individual income levels. That means we would be interested in the degree of inequality in earnings between, say, the college-educated and those without college. This is one example of between-group inequality. This figure shows that the earnings of college graduates are 1.8 times as high as the earnings of those with only a high school diploma. When we look instead at inequality between groups, we may be interested in why and how the group characteristic, in this case education, leads to larger or smaller group differences. For example, in the US, the effects of education declined in the late 1960s and 1970s, and many attributed this partially to the large increase in the number of young people attending college, driven by factors such as the Vietnam War and the GI Bill, which paid fees for returning veterans. Around the same time, the effect of work experience, proxied by age, also grew larger. In this case, it was attributed partially to the large number of young baby boomers entering the labor market. An unusually large supply of young workers and an unusually small supply of older workers existed. As the relative supply of older, experienced workers shrank, the price they received for their labor increased, a standard economic result. With a cross-group inequality, we can often test and consider fairly specific causes or explanations for a disparity in earnings based on specific characteristics. Often, however, we want to go beyond differences in income or earnings that are related to specific traits or characteristics of people. There's sometimes much disparity in earnings or income even among individuals who share the same education level, age, race, gender, or other traits. This can potentially be more puzzling, since there's no obvious factor that will drive the differences in income in these cases. To consider such differences, we often use statistical techniques, such as regression, to adjust a variable like earnings for the effects of education or age or race. We then take the part of earnings that is unrelated to the observable factors and construct measures of inequality based on the distribution of these adjusted earnings. This is sometimes called the earnings residual, the part of earnings left over after adjusting for observable factors. It's simply a way to consider the distribution of earnings after making statistical adjustment for factors we know can systematically raise or lower earnings for a given individual. Here, notice the difference between the distribution for high school graduate earners and college graduate earners. Of course, they have different average earnings, as shown by the vertical red lines. So what if we controlled for average earnings in each education group? How much inequality would remain then? This would focus attention on the spread of earnings levels around those red lines, the means, and this is what we mean when we consider within-group inequality. To move beyond working with simple visuals and to allow us to adjust for multiple factors, suppose we use the following statistical equation to express earnings as a function of, first, observable characteristics, such as the level of education, and second, the variation across people with the same level of that characteristic, education in this case. In this equation, the subscript I indicates that we're thinking about the wages of a single individual. The expression says that for any given individual, their wage is equal to two components. First, there's the average wage level for any individual with that level of education, represented by the expression W with a bar over it. Second, there's the difference between an individual's wage and the average wage for someone with their education level, represented here by the epsilon term. For some people, this epsilon will be negative, indicating that they earn less than an average person with the same level of education. For others, of course, epsilon is positive, indicating that they earn more than the average for their education level. This epsilon term is what we mean by the wage residual. If we're interested in within-group inequality, we want to examine the amount of inequality in individuals' earnings residuals, the part of their earnings not explained by observable characteristics. These two pictures illustrate the distribution of wages using observed wages on the left and the distribution of the wage residual on the right. This is after eliminating variation across individuals due to differences in education. Clearly, the difference between the highest and lowest parts of the residual distribution is smaller, showing that there's less inequality after adjusting for the part of inequality due to educational differences. Importantly, however, there's still a great deal of variation across individuals in their earnings not due to education. This means that even among those with the same level of education, there's substantial inequality. This is within group inequality. This is a concept that can be very important in understanding the recent history of U.S. inequality, and so we'll return to these concepts in the next module.